Now we're in Exodus chapter 21. What's interesting is that this chapter is actually a very controversial chapter. A lot of people like to bring it up. They say, oh, look, God is pro-slavery, right? And so what they do is they think about, for example, what you read in history books in antebellum South, for example, right? The cruelty there, the transatlantic slave trade as well is what they think about. And I actually studied this for a while. To be honest with you, I don't see how that could be used to support that. And I'll explain why as we go through it. So just a quick story. I actually had um, an individual who is now a revert Catholic, but for a time they fell away. Okay. And this person was telling me at the time, this was years ago, they said, hey, so you believe in God, right? And I said, yes. Then how come in Exodus chapter 21 it says this, this, and that? Isn't God a just God? Didn't God know that this is not good? And I honestly did not know how to respond. And so as the young people say, I got cooked. And I said, I honestly don't know how to respond to that. Give me some time and I'll research because at the time I didn't really get into this. At the time I sort of got into, does God exist? And is Catholicism true, right? That's pretty much what I was convinced of. And so how do I reconcile with this? Well, the first thing that I'd like to mention is anything that God says, it's good right off the bat. Anything that God says, it's good and it's for a purpose, even if we don't understand it, right? Because God knows the hearts of each person and God knows the future. So it's as simple as that. And God is all wise, right? And so if you speak to a physicist or a seasoned mathematician, right? You're not going to understand every single thing that they say. Even if their stuff works, they're like, okay, the stuff works. That's really all I care about. I have no idea what you're talking about. Well, that doesn't mean that they're wrong, right? Just because you don't understand why they're saying something or what they mean by it, that doesn't mean that they're wrong. So when we read these laws and you think to yourself, well, maybe God is wrong. Well, no, in actuality, we're wrong because we don't understand the full story. But God does. So if God is all knowing and the universe, like the universe, we only understand a small percentage of the universe. Imagine God who created the universe, right? We're obviously not going to be able to probe the mind of God. That's impossible, even according to the scripture. It says that in the book of Romans. So that's the first thing we got to keep in mind. Okay. It's not that there's something wrong with God, it's something that I don't understand. So we got to approach this with humility, first and foremost. Secondly, the slavery that the Bible is talking about in this chapter is actually not the slavery that you think about in history class, or as I mentioned, for example, antebellum South transatlantic slave trade, right? Instead, more properly speaking, here, Exodus chapter 21 is talking about an indentured servitude, right? Servitude would be a better word. Now, we just read in Exodus chapter 20, it uses the word slave, right? Your male and female slave. But a better translation that is more in tune with our mindset would be servant. That has a better connotation. Why? Well, let's get to the explanation now. If we read verse 1 here, it says, these are the ordinances, these are the judgments, right? These are the laws you shall lay before them. So again, God is continuing here with the laws. He says, these are the laws that you shall lay before them. Who's the them there? The ancient Israelites, okay? So before them, that is before the Israelites. So now here's the question. Here's a question for you all. Do we need to apply these civil laws into our lives? In other words, let's say I'm the president or you're the president, and you read Exodus chapter 21. Do we need to apply these laws in our country? Do we need to apply these laws in the places that we live in? Well, St. Thomas Aquinas explains it like this. Firstly, there's three types of laws in the Old Testament. So if you look at the old law, i.e., the Old Testament law, there's three types of laws. There's civil laws, ceremonial laws, and moral laws. The civil laws, also known as the judicial laws, are determinations of the justice to be held among humans. So how are we to treat each other, right? So they were given to the Israelites primarily to know how they must deal with one another as they prepare for the coming of the Messiah. But we will also see that these laws have a figurative or mystical meaning that tell us about our own spirituality. We'll get to that in a minute. And then we have the ceremonial laws. Ceremonial laws are determinations of the justice to be held between God and humans. So how are we to act in relation to God? What is that? What do you mean? Well, by ceremonial law, what we essentially mean is that they were in the with regard to the Old Testament, they were given to the Israelites primarily to foreshadow things to come, the new, right? When Christ, right? And his covenant. But they also served to prepare the Israelites to direct their worship to God. And so when we get to ceremonial laws, I'll give you examples. Right now, this chapter 21, is all about civil laws, how they are to relate to one another. Lastly, we have moral laws, and those are dictates of the natural law. So, are we bound to keep these laws as the ancient Israelites did? The answer is no. Let's go again over each of the three types of laws, but now backwards. So I spoke first about the civil laws, then ceremonial, then moral. Let me talk first about the moral, then ceremonial, then civil. So the moral laws are binding. We do need to do the moral laws of the Old Testament because, again, those are dictates of the natural law. Okay? And so because of this, right, we who follow the law of Christ, we must observe them because the law of Christ contains the moral law, the natural law, right? So that'd be like, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, right? That's why we obviously, okay? And then we have the ceremonial laws of the old law, the ceremonial laws of the Old Testament. Those are not binding on us because they were given primarily for what? To foreshadow things to come. What is to come? Well, Christ, the new covenant, etc., right? That already came though. And so we don't look at the shadows, right? I wrote down here. The ceremonial laws of the old law are not binding because they are shadows of things to come. But now that the new has come, we no longer look to the shadows, but to the new reality in Christ. Okay. So those ceremonial laws of the Old Testament, like with regard to the food, types of food that you eat, or animals to sacrifice, those are ceremonial laws. We do not observe them the way the ancient Israelites did. Instead, we have the fulfilled sense in Christ, right? Lastly, the civil laws of the Old Testament are not binding either. So as you read Exodus 21, don't think, oh, these are laws that we need to implement. It's not binding on us. You don't have to implement them. If you see a need to at some point, I mean, it's not like it'll be an issue if you see like there's a need to or something like that. But it's not binding on us, is what I'm saying, right? It's not binding on us because, again, as stated earlier, they were given to the Israelites to know how to treat one another as they prepare for the coming of Christ. And now that Christ has come, that means that these laws are no longer binding. But even though it's not binding, as I mentioned earlier, these laws tell us something about Christ, tell us something about our relationship to Christ. And so, and it's still God's word, right? That's why we study it. And so now let's continue here. Let's try to understand these laws. It says here in verse 2, when you purchase or buy a Hebrew slave or servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall leave as a free person without any payment. What does this mean? Now let me get to explaining what it means by slave or servant. Some Bible translations might say slave, others say servant. The Hebrew word that was used here is the word ebed, E-B-E-D, ebed, okay? Now, it can mean what we think of as a slave, right? Like somebody who's enslaved, but it could also refer to somebody who voluntarily is working for somebody else, a servant, a worker, somebody who works for somebody else. Now, here in Exodus chapter 21, as I mentioned earlier, a better translation would be servant, because it's not like the person is forcibly, like it's not like chattel slavery where the person is stripped of their rights or something like that. Instead, there are two circumstances in which a person will become an ebed, as described in chapter 21. Number one, they voluntarily became servants because they can't provide for themselves. So what do? They decided to work for somebody else. It's not like they could apply to Walmart or something like that. Like in those circumstances, you would have to go and work for somebody else if you couldn't grow your own crops or develop your own craft or business, right? The second way that they could become an ebed, a servant in this situation, is if they owed money that they couldn't pay off. So they would have to work it off. Okay. So in the case where someone owes somebody money, well, you pay it off, right? But what if they cannot pay it off? Well, they would work it off. That is why if you read Exodus chapter 22, verse 3b, so the latter part of verse 3, it talks about a man who's a thief and he goes and steals. Well, he has to make compensation for that. If he cannot, what does it say? He shall sell himself. What does that mean? Work it off. Does it mean that he was stripped of his rights and he had no say in the matter? Well, no, he stole and he owes money. Now he has to work it off. So it's a completely different situation than what we see, for example, in the antebellum South, for example, or in other places in the world where slavery still exists to this day, right? Now, what is interesting, as we read in verse 2, what happens if the person owes the person money and they can't pay it off? Well, they are to work it off, right? What if they owe a lifetime worth of money? What if they owe a lifetime worth of money or 10 years or something like that? Well, the Bible says they are only to work for 6 years, and then on the seventh, they're released. The debt is canceled. That's what it says in verse 2 that we just read, right? So imagine that. Imagine, you owe money to the bank, and it's like after 6 years, the debt is just canceled. That would be great, right? Imagine we had that. And not only this, but after the 6 years, on the seventh year, they're released. And according to Deuteronomy 15, verses 12 to 15, they are to receive in abundance from the boss, from the master. Some Bible translations say master, right? Or Lord. In Hebrew, it's the word Adon. It's the person that the person is working for. That person, the Adon, has to give in abundance to this person that he has just freed with no payment. So, oh, you no longer work for me. The debt is canceled. And here, take all this stuff so that you don't have to start from the bottom. And so this is nothing like the slavery that we think about, right? So as you can see, it's clearly different, right? So these Old Testament servants were to be treated with utmost respect as part of the family, right? That's why when Abraham received the covenant, what did he do? He incorporated even his servants, his workers, into the covenant, right? With God. Now, we're going to read, as we continue reading through Exodus, we're going to see that the responsibility of the Adon, the boss, the master, the Lord, was to make sure the Ebed, the servant, was taken care of, right? He would provide not only shelter and sustenance, right, food and water, fresh water, but also health care, right? Now, here's a question. Based on the Old Testament law, here's a question for all of you. Based on the Old Testament law, what do you think is the correct answer here? You have a situation where there's only one meal, enough either for only the servant or for the master. So there's enough only either for the Ebed, i.e. the servant, or the Adon, the master, lord, or boss. Who do you think is getting the meal? It is, according to Old Testament law, it's the servant. Because if the master can't provide it for him, his daily meals, then he's set free. He's not going to be working for that man anymore, because part of the responsibility of the boss is to be able to provide that. And as we read that, we're gonna see. So clearly, this is nothing like what we understand as slavery. Not only this, but this is a very interesting verse that I'd like to show you all. 1 Chronicles 2, verses 34 to 35. So here it is, 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verses 34 to 35. 1 Chronicles 2, verses 34 and 35, it speaks about an Israelite man named Sheshan. He had no sons, only daughters. And he had an Egyptian slave or servant, right, an Ebed, named Jarha. Now look at what it says here. It says, Sheshan gave his daughter in marriage to his servant Jarha, and she bore him a tie. And then the genealogy continues. So number one, the biblical author saw no problem with this, because the genealogy continues, is following the lineage of a person, right? And the genealogy continues. They didn't say, oh, well, she married an Egyptian, all of a sudden the line is just cut off. It doesn't, the bloodline is not pure anymore. No, the genealogy continued. So it was no problem for the biblical author. And also, notice how it was no problem for Sheshan. He wasn't saying, wait a minute, this Egyptian slave, am I going to be mixing my pure blood with this man? I mean, think about it in terms of when we think of slavery, right? Can you, as a slave, marry the slave master's daughter? You probably can't even look at her. You'd probably get killed, right? There is no mixing with your dirty blood. But here we see no issue with it. Instead, this Israelite woman married an Egyptian man, an Egyptian servant at that. And Sheshan and the biblical authors saw no issue with it whatsoever. So notice that it's different. You could even receive a daughter in marriage. That's how much you were part of the family. That's how much you had love, right? You had to love that person, right? And that's why when we continue, we're going to see a circumstance where a person wants to be a servant perpetually. Like how can that even happen? That cannot cross our mind because when we think of slavery, we think of chattel slavery, right? Where the person is just treated as an object. Well, that's not what the Old Testament is talking about. That's why you have circumstances where a person would rather stay with the master, with the boss, with the Adon. And we'll get to that. So there's two types of Bibles. The first type is they call it a formal equivalent translation, where you basically take the manuscripts, the ancient manuscripts, and then you translate it to the language that you want, like English, Spanish, French, or whatever. And you translate it word for word. It's kind of like if I say, you know, oh, here's a good example from the Bible itself. So in the book of Exodus, it talks about how God is slow to anger. You ever heard that verse? Yes. God is slow to anger. And so you know what it means, slow to anger in Hebrew? It actually says in Hebrew, it says God is long of nose. How are you going to translate that to people that speak English? Are you just going to say, oh, God is long of nose? That would be a formal equivalent translation. And the other type of translation is a dynamic translation, which is basically I translate it in such a way that it's understandable, even though it's not exactly how it's written in the original language. And so there it would be, oh, God is slow to anger, because God is long of nose was basically an idiomatic expression to basically say that God is slow to anger. Because the reason being is because, when people get older, I guess their noses start to look bigger because of the cartilage minimizes or something. And so long nose became associated with wisdom because older people have longer noses. And so God is like wise and he doesn't get angry easily like an old elderly person does. And so you have, and so how would you translate that though? Would you say God is long of nose, or would you say God is slow to anger? That's pretty much what we have now. That's what we have to deal with, because there's some translations where it's a dynamic translation and it could be helpful to understand. The problem is when you get to difficult verses, or when you get to verses of in question, like what is the meaning of this verse? They're not just going to translate it how it is. They're going to say they're going to input their own theology. Okay. Like, the Jehovah's Witnesses Bible, they where Jesus says, like, this is my body, this is my blood, during the Last Supper. And the Jehovah's Witness translation, which is called the New World Translation, they put, this symbolizes my body, this symbolizes my blood, because they don't believe in transubstantiation. So they add that in there. According to them, they're making it easier for people to understand, but they're adding their theology. That's the problem. So you kind of have to be a little bit careful about that. Anyways, the good thing about this Bible study is that I always try to look at the ancient manuscripts and take a look at that and then discuss based off of that. So if there's something off in the translation that I'm reading, I could point it out and then you guys could know, right, for your information. So, yes. So now we're in Exodus chapter 21. Okay. Does it say for all of you to say laws regarding slaves? That's what I mentioned. I was talking about how a better translation is servant, because that's kind of weird. Like, why is it talking about owning a slave? I'll explain why, right? And we're gonna use the Hebrew to try to understand what it's saying. Because a lot of people say, oh, look, in the Bible, it says that you could own slaves. And so how is it okay to believe in the Bible when it says that you could own slaves? Well, we're going to respond to that because this is one of the first things, like I mentioned, that somebody brought up to me. So let's take a look to see if it's the same thing. As I discussed last, what happens if, let's say, I owe you 10 years worth of a loan that you gave me? I would have to work, what, 10 years, right? Well, what does verse 2 actually say? In Exodus 21, verse 2, it says, when you purchase a Hebrew slave, and remember the term purchase there in Hebrew, as I mentioned last week, it doesn't, it could also just mean to receive, when you receive a Hebrew slave. But it's translated as purchase because it's also transactional, right? Like I am working it off. That's basically what it means. It says, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall leave as a free person without any payment, right? So he owes you money, but he's not going to pay off the rest of the money that he owes you. The max amount that he will work for you is 6 years. So how is this like, when people say, oh, slave days in the South, how is this like it when in the slave days you would work all your life until you grow old and die? They would force you to work. right? Because they take away your rights and they force you to work. How is it the same thing as this when this person got in a situation because he couldn't pay off the debt, and then on top of that, even if he owes 10, 20 years worth of debt, he only works 6 years and that's it, and then he's released. So that, and even nowadays, we're kind of enslaved to debt. Whenever you owe money to the bank and you have to pay it off, like sometimes it takes your whole life, right? Imagine after 6 years of paying it off, they go, you know what? You're released from your debt. That would be pretty nice. Well, that's what they did at these times. So it's clearly not the same thing. Also, in Deuteronomy, it says that this same person that leaves, it brings up the situation again. This person that leaves, you have to give them in abundance. So you have to give them an abundance of the stuff that you have. That way they don't start from the bottom. Does that make sense? Is that what they did during before the Civil War to the slaves? Did they say, oh, look, you worked for me too long. Here you go ahead and go. As a matter of fact, here's a large sum of money so that you don't start off from the bottom. Obviously not. In Old Testament times, they did do that. They had to. Matter of fact, there were times where people would disobey the law and it didn't happen during the days of Jeremiah. And what happened? Oh, the people were saying things like, oh, why is God punishing us? Like we're being punished because these outside like nations are invading us and we're being conquered. You know, I thought God was going to protect us, right? That was part of the promises of the Old Testament that was given to the Old Testament people, is that God is going to protect them. Well, God said one of the reasons that you're being punished is because you didn't release your servants when you're supposed to. So they work for you 6 years, that's it. Let them go, but you didn't let them go. It's like, how is that a big deal? Well, yeah, it is a big deal to God because you're mistreating somebody who's in need. That makes sense? So this is nothing like, don't when you read the term slave, especially in your Bible, if it says slave, don't think of slave, think of more like a worker, a servant, right? Because in Hebrew, it's the term ebed, which has a whole bunch of different meanings. Okay, it can mean like a slave that somebody's forced to work. That's what the Israelites were when they were in Egypt, enslaved. Or it could be somebody that like is voluntarily working or working off a debt. Now, let's go through the next verses, okay? Because it gets easier to misinterpret, okay? It gets easier to misinterpret, okay? So I'm going to show you what it's talking about. So one of the things, there's 3 things that I want you all to realize. Number 1, each and every single one of these laws that were given to the Israelites, it was as a way of getting them to a specific point, okay? It was a way to prepare them until the Messiah came, because this is during the times of Moses. We're talking like over 3,000 years ago this was given. And so it's a really long time ago. It was before Jesus even came on the earth, right? Before Jesus even came to the earth. And so this is Old Testament times before Jesus. And so what did God try to do? He was telling the Hebrews, because, Jesus is going to be born among them. He was telling them, okay, this is how I want you to act, right? Because I want you to be prepared for when the Messiah comes, when the Savior comes. So that was the purpose of these laws. If you read one of these laws and it's like, this is such a weird law, how could it apply to my time? That's because it was applying to a different people. It's kind of like if let's say my dad said, oh, you're only allowed to use your phone from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. Well, why is he giving me this law? Would it make sense to give me this law? Well, no, because I need to make phone calls, right? I got to make phone calls in the morning. I got to make phone calls sometimes at night to call people, right? But it would make sense if you give it to my younger sibling, right? Because let's say if she's addicted to the phone or something like that, or she's a little kid, young people, you don't want them to use the phone that much, if they even have a phone, right? And so that restriction would make sense. So certain laws have certain contexts, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. And so this was given to a specific group of people to shape them. Okay. So understand that. This is very important, right? This is actually very important. Okay. Number 2, this was to be used as a didactic. So what does didactic mean? Can I write on the board? So there's 3 things that I want you all to keep in mind that I'm going to write down in the notes. So 3 things to keep in mind. Number 1, it was applicable to its time. And God, who knows the heart of each person and the effect that each law is going to have in their lives, God is we shouldn't think for 1 second like, oh, these laws are crazy, because God obviously has his reasons. God is all wise. Number 2, it's a didactic. I'll explain what that means. And then number 3, we'll talk about linguistic issues, quote unquote. There's not really any issues. It's only an issue if you think about it the wrong way. So didactic, does anybody know what a didactic is? It means a teaching tool. It just means that it's like a teaching tool. So the law of Moses was given to the Israelites so that they can learn, right? It's not just, oh, this law, boom, follow this law. Instead, you're learning from the law. So when I tell you treat this person in this way, don't just treat that person that way. You need to understand that, okay, well, why am I treating that person that way? Because they're made in God's image, right? Right? Because God is a just God, and we ought to listen because God is all wise, right? And then the last thing is linguistic issues. Because as you're reading this, you're gonna watch. I'm gonna give you guys a bad example of how to read this, and then I'll give you guys what it's actually saying. Okay. So let's continue with verse 3 now. Oh yeah, and I mentioned it last week also. For those of you that are wondering, do we need to put these laws in effect today? The answer is no, because this was given to the Israelites to prepare them for the coming of the Messiah. The Messiah already came, and so we don't need to follow these laws. So verse 3, it says, if he comes into service alone, so if you have a servant that comes into service alone, he shall leave alone. If he comes with wife, family, or whatever, his wife shall leave with him, right? Because they were working in the Adon's house, in the master or the boss's house, right? Lord. So there's different ways to translate these words, okay? Sometimes Adon, you could refer to it as master, I guess. Just don't think of like, slave master racist or something like that. Or like boss or lord. And then the ebed, it could be translated as basically servant or hired worker, etc. Okay. Now here's a verse that is very much misunderstood, right? Verse 4. But if his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children belong to her master, and the man shall leave alone. So see that? That means that, if you get married, in this case, it's talking about another maidservant. So let's say you have a servant and a maidservant, right? A male servant, female servant, they get married. So the man leaves and the woman and the kids stay. Isn't that cruel? What's going on there? Well, remember these rules, these 3 rules, guys. These 3 rules, ladies and gentlemen, applicable to then didactic linguistic issues. It's a didactic, meaning that it's meant to teach certain principles. Okay? Like, think of the law of Moses like the book of Proverbs. Have any of you ever read the book of Proverbs? It's like a lot of sayings, a lot of expressions that you have to learn from it. And it's kind of interesting because sometimes, like, for example, there's this one verse that says something like, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. That means if somebody is being foolish, answer them, correct them, right? So to show them that they have no idea what they're talking about. But then the very next verse or the verse before it says the opposite. It says, don't answer them because you'll be foolish in your own eyes or something like that. So what's going on? Why is it giving me 2 contradictory advice? So it's a didactic element, right? It's not, if you take it absolutely literally, then you're just going to be like fighting with yourself. You're going to be like, wait, I'm supposed to, but it's basically, it's supposed to be, be wise, right? Know which battles to fight, right? If there's somebody who's an obvious troll, don't even waste your time, right? But if there's somebody who, in a certain situation, you could correct, especially if there's other people listening, and you could correct them to show the rest of the people that he has no idea what he's talking about. That's totally fine. So it depends on the situation, right? So think about it the same way this law is a didactic in the sense that it's establishing a principle. Now, if you have a situation where, let's say a servant and a female servant, male and female servant, they get married, what is it talking about here? It's talking about, let's say that his contract is done, but the woman's is not. Then the woman can't just say, oh, I'm married to him, so I could just dip. Instead, she has to continue to pay it off. So what must the man do? He could say, but what must the man do if he wants his wife to go with him? Remember Deuteronomy? He has to use, right? And Deuteronomy implies this. He has to use the abundance that he receives, right? Because after he leaves, oh, my work here is done. They give me an abundance. They give me money. They give me crops. They give me everything I need to be on my own. Oh, but I could get from that to pay off whatever is left of her contract, right? Because a specific contract that you're paying off. That's the idea that is established here. You can't just waltz off. Instead, you have to pay off in one way or another. What about a situation, and this is very interesting. Verse 5 says, if, however, the servant declares, I love my master, the boss, and my wife and children, I will not leave as a free person. So why does it mention the master, wife, and children? Because all of them are going to stick together in this next scenario. It says, his master shall bring him to God, and there at the door or doorpost, and it continues on saying the process that they got to do. Now, what is it talking about here? First of all, why on earth would any rational person want to stick with the master for life? Now is it clear that it's not the same slave? Don't think of the slavery of like I said, before Civil War. Don't think of that. Here you have a situation where the person is like, oh, you know what? I actually want to stay with the master. You think any slave in those times in America, when they were enslaved, that they would say, or during the transatlantic slave trade, you think that they would say, oh, yes, thank you for bringing me. I want to stay here for the rest of my life. No, that's why they had the Underground Railroad, right? So anyways, they would, you know, like Harriet Tubman, she would free why was she doing that? Why was she freeing people? Because they didn't want to be in that situation. But here in Old Testament times, people didn't mind being in that situation. If you were bad at business, if you were bad with your own, you know, dealing with yourself, you could just work for somebody else and it'll take care of you, right? You know, it'll provide for you shelter, food, water, healthcare. If there's one meal left in the house, you get the meal. That's pretty good. And if he's unable to provide it, then he has to release you because he can't provide for you. You have to go find somebody else who can. And so now here's the last part. What is he to do then if he wants to stick around? Well, obviously with his family. He could also leave with his family. But what if he decides to stay with his family, right? His master shall bring him to God, and there at the door or doorpost, he shall pierce his ear with an awl, thus keeping him as a slave for forever, or as a servant forever. Would any of you like to go through that process? Remember, some people might say, oh, I wouldn't want to go through that. Well, yeah, God never commanded you to. This was something for that time, applicable to its time. If you were talking to the people at those days, they would say, oh, what's the problem? I don't have a problem with it. We might have a problem with it, but God never commanded us to do it. So God is speaking to the right people at the right time. It's kind of like if you were to tell, like back in the day, I used to not like dancing. And I used to look people at a party. I'm like, how are you guys doing this? Dancing. Well, in my eyes, it's something terrible, but in their eyes, they're having fun, right? And so that's the idea here. So don't think that, oh, this is cruel, because in actuality, it was something that was applicable for its time, that the people could actually accept. Now, when it says his master shall bring him to God, who is the one that's representing God? When it says he shall take him to God, what does that mean? What does it mean by he shall take him to God? He's saying the judges. So he shall take him to the judges. Why? Because with his own mouth, he has to say, I want to be this person. I want to work for this person for the rest of my life. And so it's interesting that this actually has a connection to Jesus, because Jesus gladly became a servant of the Father to be with who? The wife of Christ, which is the church, and then his children, which is us, the members of the church. So all of these laws also have a figurative symbolism. That's why it's worded a certain type of way. Like, wait a minute. If the Bible is trying to express that, why didn't Moses say it like this? Well, one of the reasons is because it establishes a mystical interpretation that connects us with Jesus. Now, here's the last one that might be difficult for people to interpret, but it says, when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go free as male slaves do. What is this talking about? Doesn't this sound like, you know, he's taking advantage of his daughter, like maybe to make money? His daughter is going to get abused, objectified. Meanwhile, he's over here making money. Is that what it's talking about? It might sound like that because, you know, we watch the news and we hear the crazy stuff that happens. So we could have, but in actuality, it's not talking about that. No man was allowed to prostitute his daughter according to the law of Moses. Leviticus, let me read to you Leviticus chapter 19. Verse 29. This is what it says here, Leviticus. This is, by the way, Leviticus is the very next book. This is what it says here. It says, do not profane your daughter. Do not disrespect your daughter by making her a prostitute, lest the land fall into prostitution and the land become full of evil, depravity, right? So in Leviticus, it says, no prostituting your daughter. So that's not what's happening here. A lot of people say, oh, he's prostituting his daughter. No, it's not. Leviticus says that you can't do that. What is it then? Remember that the term sell can also refer to becoming a maidservant. That's essentially what's happening. His daughter is becoming a maidservant with his permission. And so it says, she shall not go free as the male servants do. So when their time is up, when their contract is done, the male servants can just go. But the female servants need to have somebody that's taking care of them, especially in these times, because it was very dangerous for a woman to be by herself. That's the idea. So who is it? Well, this is what's going on. Let me explain it here. It's in my notes. So in Exodus 22:3, the very next chapter, a man who cannot give back what he stole, like a thief who stole something and I can't pay it back, he has to work it off, right? And what does it say? It says that he sells himself. So it's talking about working it off. When it says he sells himself or sells his daughter, it's talking about that she becomes a maidservant or he becomes a servant. That's in reference to the work he is doing, right? That is transactional. I.e., it's the work he produces to pay off whatever he needs, right? And it's the same thing that's happening here. It turns out in the ancient Israelite culture, both men and women presented gifts or money to their parents' family. Not the parents, to their partner's family. Why? Well, this custom came about, right? Dowries and bride prices, because whenever a person was missing from the household, you had a missing worker, and so it was harder to financially be stable. And so what they would do is whenever people would get married, each family would provide the other family with financial help. And it just stuck. It became the custom. And so that's what it's referring to here. So you have this practice, right? Both men and women presented gifts or money to their partner's family. If they couldn't afford it, both the man or the woman, they would work to obtain one. And so that's what's happening here. So she's becoming a maidservant in order to provide the dowry. But what happens if the man ends up saying, look, I don't want to marry you anymore? What happens? It says, but if she displeases her master, who had designated her for himself, so meaning that he doesn't like her anymore, he shall let her be redeemed. That means that she is to go, right? He has no right. And here's the thing. Here's something that people would do in those times. They would take women that they didn't want and they would sell them to like foreign traders, kind of like what happened to Joseph in the book of Genesis when he was sold by his brothers, because there were foreign traders that would go into different lands to trade stuff and acquire things to sell back in their land. One of the things that they would take was humans. So they were trafficking humans. That's what happened to Joseph. His own brothers sold him to slavery. And so they would also do that to women. Women that they didn't want, they would just give them away, right, for money. But God brings this up and he says, you're not doing that. He has no right to sell her to a foreign people. He has broken faith with her. So it's seen as something wrong. The man did something wrong, right? Because she was looking forward to that marriage, but like he ended up breaking it off, which was not right. Now just a point of clarification. It says he has no right to sell her to a foreign people since he has broken faith with her. So does that mean that if he married her, then he would have a right to sell her? Well, no. In the Hebrew, what it's basically designating is that he did something wrong. So it's frowned upon. It's not looked at as something right. Now, if you have another circumstance where you have the master's son is going to marry her. So let's say she's like she's too young for the father, so she's going to marry his son. Same situation. He shall treat her according to the ordinance for daughter. So she shall be treated as a daughter. And then you have another situation. What if this guy takes another wife? If he takes another wife, he shall not withhold her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he does not do these three things for her, she may leave without cost, without any payment. So like In other words, he's not going to receive anything. He just has to let her go because he can't provide for her. So this last part is really interesting because what is it talking about here? Is it talking about like if he marries a second wife after her? Or is it talking about he doesn't like her and so he marries somebody else? There's two ways to understand this. Some people understand it as, this guy's married a second woman, so he has to provide everything for the first woman, just as he normally did. But it's more likely that it's not talking about that. Instead, what it's talking about is a situation where he breaks it off with that woman to marry somebody else. He has to continue to provide for her. He has to continue to provide for her. When it says marital rights or conjugal rights, it's not talking about having relations because the Hebrew word is onah, which can also refer to providing sustenance. If you look at, for example, the Hebrew word used in verse 10 is onah. The term onah can mean season or duty. And therefore, it could be used in different ways, right? So in the ancient Middle East, you have different societies that had similar laws. And the wording is interesting because the laws would basically say like, oh, food, clothing, and oil, or food, clothing, and shelter. So that's what it's talking about when he uses the term onah. He has to be providing for her. So even if he breaks it off with her, he has to continue providing for her until she, marries somebody else or does whatever she does, right? So remember, these laws were given in such a way that they're like being formed, right? They're like, okay, that's why if you look by the time you get to the times of Jesus, like for example, polygamy, it didn't exist in this society at least. Because the people were being shaped with these laws to break out of any old bad habits that they had. That's why we call it a didactic. It was meant to teach them and they went learning how to act. Okay, let me just read a few more things. It says, whoever strikes someone a mortal blow must be put to death. So anybody who kills somebody, put them to death. However, regarding the one who did not hunt another down, but God caused death to happen by his hand, I will set apart for you a place to which that one may flee. So what is it saying there? It's saying if a person accidentally kills somebody, right? It's part of God's plan in the sense that God allowed it. Then the person's not going to be put to death, but they're going to go somewhere that they could flee, because what would happen if you accidentally kill somebody? Well, there's typically somebody in the family that's going to want to kill you. And so I'm going to give you a place that you can go to be protected as you await a fair trial, right? But when someone kills a neighbor after maliciously scheming to do so, meaning that it was planned out, you must take him even from my altar and put him to death. Whoever strikes father or mother shall be put to death. So that's why these laws about put them to death if they kill somebody, put them to death if they hit their mother or their father. Why is that? And then look, a kidnapper, so somebody who kidnaps somebody, whether he sells the person, right, so like a slave trader, or the person is found in his possession, shall be put to death. So even the kidnapper is. So literally, if they applied this law during the transatlantic slave trade, what do you think would happen? All the slave traders would have been put to death. So clearly, they weren't actually following what the Old Testament says, right? As they claim to be, right? And so why this? Why these laws about putting them to death? Whoever curses father or mother shall be put to death. So in the Old Testament, all this stuff was punishable by death in Old Testament times. Why? So that they could set themselves straight, right? So remember the first time God said something like this was in Exodus 19? When he said, hey, don't touch the mountain. This is a holy mountain. I'm going to manifest my presence. Don't touch the mountain. Anybody who touches the mountain, even an animal, they'll be put to death. What happened? Did anybody touch the mountain? No. So God freed them from slavery in Egypt. And then what? They complained because they didn't have, they were lacking food. Then they complained because they didn't have water. They were even going to stone Moses. Imagine that. Imagine being amongst these people and they're going to stone Moses because they were mad, right? And so why did God say that? Well, so that they could set themselves straight. Oh, I was going to do that, but now that you say that, I'm not going to do it, right? So that they could learn. It's a didactic. Remember, they're learning how they are to act. They just got out of Egypt. They spent many years there. They got a lot of customs that are not good. So now God is trying to beat it out of them.